High Sheriff, Dean, what a wonderful, uplifting service you are giving us this evening, and what an immensely fitting welcome to all those who serve the law in Oxfordshire. On behalf of us all, thank you. It is a long time since the High Sheriff and I set off fire extinguishers together in New College, but we probably still owe them a fine. Well, High Sheriff, I hope you continue to look after your judges well. The judges used to be lodged in a most beautiful house in St. Giles. Its garden has a summer house whose domed roof appears to be a tiny and preliminary version of the Radcliffe cameras. Well, Judge, I am so sorry it is no longer yours, I'm afraid. But what a magical, if zany way that must have been to look back on a day in court. From the Temple to Christ Church, from one beautiful, tranquil sight on the River Thames up and to another. Heavens, they're serene, but they have seen tumultuous times. In 1215, King John spent Palm Sunday and the first half of Holy Week here in Oxford. Then he came to us, to the Temple, until Easter Day on the 19th of April. Surely, he still had a fair wind against the rebellious barons. Not for long. On the 5th of May, those barons declared themselves free from their allegiance. On the 17th, London fell to the rebels, and it was clear the king must concede a charter constraining his power. A month later, king and barons met at Runnymede, once more on the Thames, halfway between yourselves and us, and what we know as Magna Carta was sealed. Tumultuous times indeed. It was a pleasure, shortly before COVID, to be invited to speak at the International Conference on the Rule of Law at Renmin University in Beijing. 100 local jurists looked after 25 Westerners with immense courtesy. An elderly scholar, clearly the father of the law faculty at Renmin, opened the conference with a keynote speech that was, of course, translation throughout. Our speaker told us, there are two forms of the rule of law, the Western Christian liberal rule of law and the Eastern Confucian authoritarian rule of law. They are of equal validity. Those who live under one have no reason and no right to criticize or to subvert the other. Under the Western Christian liberal rule of law, individuals have rights. Under the Eastern Confucian authoritarian rule of law, it is a great privilege to be a human being. That privilege brings responsibilities. Chief among them is the responsibility of every individual to promote the unity of the nation. Those who fail to do so would be held accountable for their actions. All this had been laid out by President Xi in the recent 17th conference of the Chinese Communist Party plenary session on the management of religion. One or two of our Western colleagues wanted to explore this principle further. What, they asked, if a citizen thought that the executive, the government itself, was acting contrary to law or to the interests of the nation? The replies were uniform from all sides of the room. It is the responsibility of every citizen to promote the unity of the nation. Those who fail to do so would be held accountable for their actions, as had been laid out by President Xi in the recent 17th conference of the Chinese Communist Party plenary session on the management of religion. I do not tell this story to belittle the Chinese rule of law, of course not. We are approaching in our relationships with Beijing the latest and clearly a crucial instance of a long familiar question in international law. Some of us may, of course, want to question the professor's premise. Do we even accept that there is a Western rule of law which can now helpfully be described as Christian? In a famous dictum of the 1680s, Sir Matthew Hale declared, "Christianity is part or parcel of the laws of England." But the motto was already in retreat 100 years ago. Lord Sumner sought in 1917 to hit Hale's maxim out of the ground. The phrase, "Christianity is part of the law of England," he said, is really not law. It is rhetoric. "Thou shalt not steal" is part of our law, but "thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself" is not part of our law at all. Lord Sumner, of course, was right, but was he missing a larger point? Please bear with me. Here comes some egregious special pleading. It is possible to see in the teaching of Jesus and of the Bible a seed sown that would, as a millennium and more went by, come to animate and inform all liberal Western law. The seed? A conviction that every individual is in equal measure a creature and a child and the care of God. And Christian jurists will now never let this go. 15 years after Lord Sumner had shaken the law free from that command of Jesus, it came back with a vengeance in one of the most famous judgments in English law, Lord Atkin. The rule that you are to love your neighbor becomes in law, you are not to injure your neighbor. And the lawyer's question put to Jesus himself, "Who is my neighbor?" receives a restricted reply. You must take reasonable care to avoid acts or omissions which you can reasonably foresee would be likely to injure your neighbor. Who, then, in law is my neighbor? If we are to be a town, a county, a country, a community at all, we need the structure and shape, the constraints and protections of a living body of law. And we need for its energizing, motivating blood in all who are called to obey it, and above all, in all those who serve it, the love of our neighbor. Some people are readily loved. Others, let's be honest, test our tolerance and our sympathy to the limit. Of course, it need not be a religion, any religion, that fuels our care for others and makes us a genuine living nation. But how hard it still is to provide without religion, without a God whose children we all are, a compelling ground for universal human dignity and rights. We can stipulate such rights, and philosophers have for 200 years established the rights of potentially, possibly, or actually rational and mature moral agents. But this does leave exposed to terrible chill winds those who will never or never again be such agents, and it is just those for whom the law and the neighbor alike take special care. What on earth was I going to speak about in Renmin University, faced with our hosts' gracious, firm espousal of their own authoritarian rule of law? Ah, well, there was no alternative. Magna Carta it was. Not the famous clauses about due process and fair trial. They ensure nothing without an independent, enforceable sanction against an executive that denies them. No, the one to go for was the last spellbinding clause of 1215, the long, careful definition of the processes to be followed if the king broke the charter's terms. An extraordinary but practical, enforceable mechanism to strip the delinquent king of everything he owned and every power he claimed. No one was safe from the king if the king was safe from everyone. The supreme executive must be subject to the rule of an enforceable law. What can I say? No, there was no presumption of immunity in 1215. Here, ironically, in a clause annulled within 8 weeks and never reissued, lies the bedrock of our rule of law. My talk, I may say, was greeted by our hosts with enthusiastic, if slightly synchronized, applause. I was grateful. But the question still stands. Is the Western, Christian, liberal rule of law, with its care for and rights of the individual, a localized totem, with vestiges left around the world of its past in Western Christian colonialism, struggling to hold its own in a world in which the tides of power are flowing, it seems, irresistibly against us? Or do we believe that in this rule of law there is still, even for cultures long set on quite different trajectories, a blessing, forever contested, vulnerable, abused, and evolving, offered by God to all of his children? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself.